video on South Sudan. Today, I will finally deliver on this promise as I started researching South Sudanese history. Now, ever since independence, South Sudan has had quite the unfortunate history. As a whole, Sudan is overwhelmingly Muslim Arab, yet the South had a population of mostly Christians and indigenous faith people. Mostly due to this, right upon Sudanese independence, the South had begun a civil war, fighting for more autonomy and representation within the nation. By the end, around 1 million, mostly South Sudanese, would have died from the fighting. A peace would eventually be signed, yet underlying tensions were not solved, causing yet another conflict in 1983, which would last 22 years. Another estimated 2 million would die, with even more millions displaced. South Sudan had already been underdeveloped, but it was now one of the worst places to live on Earth. Yet, they had finally achieved their goal, and in 2011, it became the youngest new nation on Earth. But again, this was not the end of troubles, as only 2 years later, a civil war would break out to further devastate the nation. Only by 2020 did South Sudan finally, arguably for the first time since Sudanese independence, reach a state close to normalcy and peace, with their first election post-independence scheduled for this December. So obviously, things can go far better for South Sudan, which we will explore in this video. But as you might expect, this will not have drastic consequences for world history, and this video will very much focus on South Sudan itself. Now, our story starts during British colonialism. As Britain came to Africa, Muhammad Ali's dynasty ruled over Egypt. During their years of power, Egypt had transformed from a part of the Ottomans to practically more powerful than it, expanding their domains in Africa greatly, first into Sudan and then into South Sudan as well. But Egypt would have their own issues. When their golden age ended, economic turmoil and debt trapping would lead to Britain, slowly but steadily, increasing their control over the nation or turning it into a full protectorate. Now, during this British period, Sudan's situation changed. Egypt would try to claim Sudan as an inherent part of Egypt, creating a large, unified state across the length of the Nile. Britain, though, was not interested in such a large protectorate, choosing instead to weaken it by splitting it apart. Officially, Sudan would from that point onwards be co-ruled by Egypt and Britain. In practice, as you might expect, Britain controlled Sudan with very little Egyptian influence. This now started a new chapter in South Sudanese history, as Britain recognized the differences between North and South. While not official, the British would practically administer the colony as two separate regions. They ensured that the Northern Arabs no longer sent administrators to rule over the South, instead encouraging the Christianization of the South while propping up English as the lingua franca. This situation, while good for the political independence of the South, also had a significant drawback. Northern merchants would also be barred from trading with the South, and this economic isolation would further impoverish the region. Adding to this, Britain primarily invested in Northern Sudan as they considered the South largely unfit for modernity. Despite South Sudan having a lot of valuable agricultural land, it was left to lay empty as the region fell behind the North. But then, in 1946, Britain would suddenly reverse their policy towards the South, giving in to North Sudanese demands to reunite the divided colonies in two. Why would Britain do this? Well, for two main reasons. First, to quell dissent in Egypt, Sudan, and other Arab regions of the empire, preventing costly potential conflicts over the region. Secondly, after World War II, it was clear that the British Empire was done long-term. The colonies had to be prepared for independence, and Britain considered South Sudan, with its weak economy, isolation, and small population, unfit for independence. Now, this will be our main point of departure. Rather than uniting Sudan in 1946, I want Britain to double down on it, splitting the colony apart officially. There are various reasons why they might do this. One is fears of an Egypt-Sudan union, something seriously pushed for at the time. Such a powerful state could realistically jeopardize British control over the Suez. Alternatively, we could get the British population and politicians more invested in the Christianized South, refusing to hand it over to the majority Arab North. When, likely around the 1960s, South Sudan gains their independence as well, they could very well have chosen a different name for themselves. A number of potential options in our timeline were Azania, the Nile Republic, or the Kush Republic. Sadly, it is impossible to tell which of these they would choose, so let's stick with South Sudan for the sakes of this video. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Now during this period, and slightly before, it would be nice if Britain invested at least a little bit into South Sudanese agriculture and infrastructure. But at the end of the day, a different source of wealth would have to carry South Sudan. The nation is rather rich in natural resources, amongst which oil, having the third largest reserves in Africa. This, at least in the short term, can be a great kickstarter for an underdeveloped economy. And especially with its relatively small population, there is real potential there. Especially because South Sudan can benefit a lot more than they did in our timeline, where the North siphoned most oil revenues away, and even after independence, oil pipelines run through the North, demanding 50% of revenue for the privilege. A South Sudan that is independent earlier would have much more freedom to either build their pipelines through other, less hostile nations like Kenya, or negotiate a better deal with Sudan. Unlike a nation like the Saudis, South Sudan cannot rely on oil forever, but it could offer an amazing head start. This, however, can only work if the most important condition is satisfied: a non-corrupt, stable, and preferably democratic leadership. A good comparison is Botswana, another African nation with great natural resources, their case, diamonds, and a small population. Botswana ranks amongst the least corrupt and most democratic regimes in Africa. They have taken the profits from the diamond trade and invested it back into the nation rather than having it disappear into the pockets of the elites, as is the norm in various dictatorships like Gabon. A similar responsible government is imperative for South Sudan's long-term success. Now these factors combined would be enough to have South Sudan slowly transition into a respectable nation and economy. Though, considering the very short framework for improvements that we have, it's not like they join Europe or Asia in terms of wealth yet. There is still a lot of work to do. But today, South Sudan has a GDP per capita of $1,000, a number which is already greatly bolstered by oil exports which don't actually go to the population. If South Sudan can successfully set up their oil exports, using the profits to educate the people and start extracting the various other resources in the nation, even setting up some industry of their own, the nation could easily trend to 6,000 to 10,000 GDP per capita. While to my Western audience, this might not sound like a major change, it could make South Sudan anywhere from the 1st to 4th in terms of GDP per capita in Africa. It is the difference between crippling poverty or a standard of living comparable to Latin America or the Balkans. Now, like I said, I doubt that this would lead to earth-shattering changes elsewhere. Yet for the people of South Sudan, decades of hardships have been avoided. Their independence is retained, and they are one of Africa's biggest success stories. By an alternate modern day, South Sudan would be a respected founding member pushing for the East African Federation between the states of the region. As the richest of these nations, South Sudan would play a major role in this founding. By this point, we are getting into future predictions, but South Sudan could be very well situated, integrate the infrastructure and economies of the nations, and become the major economic heart of the region with their well-educated population. By an alternate 2050, it is not unthinkable that an alternate South Sudan is a respected part of a greater East African Federation, one slowly turning itself into one of Africa's, if not the world's, major powers. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you for watching, and goodbye.